Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the sessions this morning. Our next speaker is Michael Marriott. So Michael is a senior strategy and research analyst at Digital Shadows. So he's written numerous articles and papers and is regularly published as well. And he's going to be talking about account takeovers targeting Australia. So I think Michael has just arrived into the room and we'll switch over to him momentarily. But if you guys have any questions, just post them up on the Q&A. Thanks very much.
All right, hello everybody. Thanks for joining. I know it's getting towards the end of the sessions now, penultimate final push. So I appreciate you taking the time out of what's probably your work day to come and listen here. I'm going to try and keep this as educational as possible. I know a lot of you haven't joined to hear a vendor talk, so there will be a small element of Digital Shadows and its solution Searchlight, but I'm going to try and keep it looking at some cybercrime trends that we've seen and some free advice at the end and some resources that you can take away, because I think that's always a nice thing to have. So we've got about 30 minutes. I'm going to first outline why people care about account takeover. That probably seems like an obvious point, but there's a bit of framing that I think it needs to start with. We'll then move on to what I think is the sexy stuff, talking about what we've seen in the criminal underground and some of the trends that we've seen there. And then we'll finish on some tools to combat credential exposure and this reuse of passwords that we see as rampant, both from a free perspective and also what we're seeing in terms of how we can help clients solve some of the issues that are associated with all of this noise that comes from these criminal forums. So I think just starting off at a really, really high level, we all have been talking about the new normal of COVID and whatnot. We know that we've got a lot of remote workers. We know we've got an expanding attack surface. We know now that we've talked before about the castle walls and the perimeter. We've got loads of stuff that protects that perimeter. But whilst we were talking maybe 4 years ago about how the perimeter doesn't really exist anymore, and that was quite a novel idea, not really such a novel idea anymore, especially with everything that's happened recently. Now, particularly with brands and organizations that are quite public facing, they're really understanding that you can't delineate how you look online with the type of security that we were trying to approach within the network as well. So I've just flashed up some things that we commonly see, whether that's misconfigured devices, the use of shadow IT, vulnerabilities on all of these growing endpoints that you have. We're also developing more and more applications. So we're seeing a lot of leakage around there. We're seeing developers or contractors with really sensitive information that's just being made publicly available. And we know that attackers are just absolutely loving all of this, and it's just making life so much easier for the attackers who are just surveilling for this information and using it as part of their campaigns. And then you've got the impersonation of your online as well, so domains and phishing kits and things like that. I think the one thing that always comes up, though, is the topic of this talk, and that's employee credentials. Especially now, everybody's signing up for loads of different online services, but realistically, this has been happening for a long time. Even on sites, you wouldn't expect people to be using their corporate email addresses. I always remember we were pretty shocked at the amount of corporate email addresses we saw when Ashley Madison got breached, for example. So this is something that is really tangible, really is something that security teams can do something about as well. So it's a high risk if those accounts get taken over, but it's something that you can actually go and action, and you can show some really good metrics in terms of the security team's effectiveness. And yeah, this is another reason why account takeover is just so much front of mind for a lot of the security teams that we talk to. One of my favorite activities of the year is to read the Verizon DBIR. In this one, very similar to in previous years, the main way, just the tried and tested technique of attackers is just the reuse of credentials. And this is this year's Verizon TBIR, but I think maybe 8 years ago there was a great quote which was basically, why use a cruise missile when the front door is open? So you're not having people, generally for most organizations, a threat model isn't a 0 day or even a newly released exploit for a new vulnerability. It's just something really easy. It's the reuse of your employees' credentials that's just providing such an easy way into the organization. And you may say, well, we've got to have multi-factor authentication. What are we doing? Why would we not have that? The reality is that obviously it's a business decision and it's somewhat more complex than that. And even on top of that, we've seen plenty of attackers bypassing different second factor authentication. So particularly SMS based. So that is not unheard of, but I'm sure many of you listening in will be familiar with that anyway. So given that this is such a large area of interest, we conducted a good amount of research probably a month ago. So this is pretty fresh. We've got a repository of about, at the time it was 15 billion when we kicked off the research in June this year. That has since grown by about 1.5 billion. So that gives you an idea of the rate at which credentials are being exposed online. So there's a lot there, and we thought, well, why don't we dig into it and see, not all credentials are created equal. So what are the trends that we're seeing? What's most attractive for threat actors, and what can we understand about that perhaps informs our own defenses? So I thought I would take a snapshot of that was Australia focused, because it just makes it a bit more interesting. And there is a surprising, not really surprising, there is a significant amount of activity targeting Australia, hence the title of this talk, I guess. So this one was just from a couple of weeks ago, from an actor on a well-known Russian cybercriminal forum called Rot. So this actor, he's logged on, good evening fellas. He specializes in Australian stuff, and particularly he's got a penchant for financial services companies, but doesn't stop there. There's plenty more fish in the sea that he's seeking to sell access to. And this is, in this case, I think it was a Citrix logon. This individual was looking to basically sell a username and password that would provide access to a whole ton of really sensitive information. And this is something that we've been seeing an awful lot of, not just in Australia, but across the world. So I took just the Australian examples for this presentation and some that we've seen in the last few months in terms of the actors that are selling access. Perhaps we have seen a big uptick in the last few months, and perhaps that's related to expanding attack surfaces. Perhaps it's just a trend. We've seen things like particularly the selling of RDP access or domain admin. These are the ones that are the sexiest, the best level of credential that attackers have to offer. They go for the big bucks. So while you can pick up you can probably pick up a credential for $1 on most dark web marketplaces, you'll find that predictably these domain admin accesses, they go from between $2,000 and $6,000 a piece. So these individuals, they don't want to take on the risk. They don't want to be actually going and looking to monetize the databases or what you can get from the access and do lateral movement and things. They just want a quick sell. So they've got the access somehow. Maybe they've exploited some vulnerability or used some default RDP credentials or whatever. They've got access and they're just selling it on to the highest bidder. So they're often doing it on auctions. That tends to be a really popular way of driving up the value. But this is really becoming something that's pretty popular. It's something that we've seen changes in as well. So previously, maybe a year ago, somebody would come on and say, I got access to such and such bank or such and such university. And then they would just have a bidding war. And it turns out that that people are monitoring for this, so they have to be a bit more cryptic about it. So there's often a bit of a jigsaw puzzle that you have to put together. So they give an Alexa ranking number of employees, and they try and mask it like that, but still be as appealing as possible. So we've got our own closed sources team that go and try and ascertain whether those belong to our clients or anything like that. But these are absolutely some of the most valuable that attackers seek and sell online. We did, as part of the research, and you'll all be able to have a copy of this research after the presentation. As part of it, we did a broader analysis, not just in Australia, but across the world in 2020, what the average prices for different types of industry domain admin access were. So we've broken them down there. The highest cost of those were for local government, and there were quite a few listings there. I think that's probably in line with a lot of the ransomware targeting as well. And I won't go into it in this presentation, but I think there's probably a correlation between the selling of RDP access credentials and the ability to execute ransomware in different environments. So these tend to be the ones that are being traded online. Obviously, there's a big chunk of other that tended to be a mix of higher education and a bit of retail as well, from my recollection. So just to give you an idea, when we think of credentials, we often think about those low-level ones, or the ones that are just freely available floating around, but there is a bit of a trove that is some pretty high-value stuff. And then the second high-value thing, now this is a little bit further back. This is about a year ago, but it was something that has always stuck with me because of its nature, and I'll go into it. But our closed sources team engaged with a Russian-speaking cyber criminal, and this one is across a messaging platform. It was a Jabber conversation. So we were discussing with this one individual, and they were explicitly looking for certain email address inbox access. So they were after, and you can see possibly on the screen if you've got it up full, accounts payable, accounts receivables, payables, and receivables. And I think this now seems like a really obvious point to me, but when I used to think of corporate emails, I thought of Jim in accounting, or just somebody else in a different department, but it was their inbox. And this really woke me up to the fact that, well, actually, why would it not be these departmental inboxes? These have got way more valuable information in. If you think about the types of invoices and payment information that's available, if you were to have access to these type of inboxes, it would be absolutely massive. So this individual, they provided a list of exactly actually 100 companies that were located in both Australia and in the UK. And those companies were generally manufacturing companies, or they were financial services related specifically to the manufacturing industry, and those looking at rental. So it was an incredibly targeted, orchestrated attempt to get these inboxes and the credentials for them. And is even more surprising was that we think in terms of the prices of things going in the criminal underground, you'd think that maybe getting a nice piece of malware or an exploit for something would reach the highest cost. And actually, no, it was somebody going to the effort to get something from an inbox with accounting information in. That's the thing that was getting, I think, tens of thousands of dollars was the offer for that. So a huge amount of money going around looking for these types of things. So this is, I said this was in the back of my mind. So when we were doing this research, I really wanted to understand, well, I wonder, just by pure chance, of the people that are using these online accounting tools, how many people have used these corporate payments inboxes to sign up that have subsequently been breached? So we had a little look in. It turns out there's an awful lot that were being used. In fact, there were 2 million accounting inboxes that are exposed online, freely in circulation across the criminal underground. And I expected there to be a good amount. I did not expect them to be 2 million. And you can see the distribution here, invoices, partners, vendors, billing, admin, so on and so forth. So this admittedly was based on a large data sample. We were looking at about 15 billion credentials here. I think still though, 2 million accounting inboxes is a number that we should definitely be paying attention to. Especially as about 90% of the passwords that we found within those 15 billion were already in plain text. So I don't need to emphasize the significance of that. That just makes it so much easier for attackers, particularly as I'll go on to the ones that are using these credentials to brute force, to put into a credential stuffing tool that then automatically goes and looks up and looks for valid credential pairs. So incredibly easy for attackers, 90%, and even the rest of them, the remaining 10% that are not plain text, they're in a format that it doesn't need a nation state adversary to go and actually understand what that password is. So awful lot of passwords, awful lot of sensitive information, and it's a pretty low barrier to entry. We also distributed it based on the average number of credentials per organization per sector. So you can see across a few of these, we did take a few of these out of the data sample. So particularly telecommunications, if you think about those that have got customers who would be using the same email domain as employees, we tried to really focus on the employee credential issue in this circumstance. So we did remove those in this piece of analysis, but you can still see just a lot of credentials that are being alerted. 47,603 for a technology company on average. And if you think about the good number of technology companies that we sampled, probably only have 5,000 employees. That really gives an idea of the scale at which these credentials are being exposed online. So this is something that obviously we alert our clients to a lot. There are a lot of credentials flying around. I said there are 1.5 billion in the last month or so. So an awful lot out there. And as I'll get onto at the end when I show what we're doing, we're trying to find ways to help organizations triage those, work out whether it's relevant to them, and then actually go and validate them before they have to go through the whole triage process. So we're trying to get to that validation stage earlier so that it will just save a bunch of time. So we'll get onto that very shortly. One of the cool tidbits actually that I always like to bring up when I'm talking about credentials is nothing on the slide, but it's a nice little trick that I've learned for sort of heads of security that I've chatted to that are trying to demonstrate what they're doing, particularly to the C-level and executives who don't perhaps understand digital risk protection or threat intelligence or what's going on in the cyber criminal underground. So they're trying to make cases that potentially when executives travel, they end up exposing themselves, and how can they go and manage that risk and get awareness of that? So whatever tool you may be using, whatever visibility you have into credentials, one cool thing to do is when executives get back from a business trip to Russia or China, what a nice thing to do is actually go and type in their email address and show the timeline of when that was exposed. Because I feel that when you start to bring that to the executive level and you show that actually tangibly for them, here's what's happened and here's where you're exposed from that VIP level, that really starts to resonate with those individuals and sort of shows what security team, the value that they're adding. They're not just securing things and devices, they're actually making a business impact that should really have a powerful message. Just a little tip there that I find helps a lot of people just from a personal career-wise. So there are a few things that these then get used for. So if you think about all of these credentials that are out there, some of these can get used to just like a straightforward reuse. So if you get these early enough when they're at their highest value, when they've just been breached, then actually you can go and potentially reuse those for another account. That tends to have diminishing returns when those get further and further traded across different locations, and they start to get used quite creatively. So perhaps many of you will be familiar with credential stuffing tools. You can see one screenshot that I've thrown up there. There are a few that are available. So for many, many years, if any of you were familiar with credential stuffing, the name Century MBA would ring true to you. That was the absolute cool kid on the block that everybody would be talking about and getting different configuration files for, and that's what people would be doing. So for those not familiar, you essentially have this piece of software, you throw in a load of previously breached credential pairs that you know has come from another site, you then point it at another website, and it just circulates through them until it finds matches. Century MBA was really successful because it was able to, on occasion, bypass capture controls. So there was a huge trade in Century MBA configuration files to make sure you were going to specific sites. So that was so popular for many, many years until this year. It's actually, we've got a new kid on the block, and that kid is Open Bullet. Although Century MBA still is a popular tool, it's actually, we looked at the mentions, I may or may not have a slide on it, I don't, but Open Bullet was actually far more popular than Century MBA now. So just an easier to use interface that really appealed to people. So just want to be aware of, if you do get asked internally, perhaps you've got to write a report on credential stuffing because that's been in the news. Century MBA absolutely still one, but don't forget about this rising star, Open Bullet. That's one angle. The other angle, which I think is possibly even cooler, is one that's emerged in the last, we spotted it in, I think, April 2018 was when this market first emerged. It came out of a very famous Russian-speaking cybercriminal forum called exploit.n. This was birthed from that community and advertised heavily on there in early 2018. Just as with any tech company, they went through a beta phase where they tested it with trusted customers. But essentially what it is what you would previously have to do when you're committing fraud, and there may be fraud folks that are on the line now. So I'm sorry if I'm butchering how you do your job, but there's the concept of fingerprinting. So you can get a good idea if somebody's legitimate by things like their cookies, browser information, IP address, and other little nuggets like that. So what a threat actor has to do is, if they want to use an account which perhaps the fraud team are monitoring for suspicious activity, they have to then go and buy a ton of other stuff. So they need to go and buy different proxies, they need to rotate those, they need to work out what browser information, they need to work out the zip code or the postcode of the individual whose account they're stealing, and so on. And it's just a massive pain because it's just a lot of work, and if there's nothing in there, it tends to be a bit of a turn off for the actual attackers that are trying to monetize that. So Genesis Market essentially disrupted this whole thing. And they said, well, instead of you getting all of these disparate pieces from different locations, why not? You can just rent an identity for a day. So they provide this website. It's got a Chrome extension. It turns out Russian cyber criminals love Chrome extensions. And you just rent. So you can rent Sebastian for a day. And they've got automatic injects that they've got from botnets and different captures online, and they all combine to form this identity of real world stolen stuff. So instead of you getting an account, then having to work out where they live and then getting proxies and whatnot, all of a sudden you have all of that. You just rent them. You have their screen size. You have their cookie information. You are them. You are impersonating them. They already have all of that. So This is a scary, I said cool, I shouldn't say cool, but it's a scary trend that has really taken off in the last 2 years. So it is firmly out of beta stage now. There's tens of thousands of identities on Genesis Market, and it continues to grow today. They've even got other markets that are copycat markets. So Tenebris and Underworld Market. Underworld Market used to go by a different name that I have forgotten, but those are now the 3 biggest. And you can see Genesis Market still absolutely with 65% of the discussions that we analysed online focused on Genesis Market. And that certainly rings true with its credibility and its standing within the cyber criminal community. So yeah, that's just one thing not everybody is familiar with. So I wanted to share that piece of information about that new trend in bypassing fingerprinting controls. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. So I thought it was important to finish on actually what you can do about this. Now, it's always lovely to chat to Australian security professionals because one of your own is, of course, Troy Hunt, who has done an absolutely terrific job of bringing exposed credentials and breaches really to the forefront of people's minds and making sure that they have a way to actually understand whether they've been involved in these breaches. So often when I kind of flash up this slide at the end, there's a surprising amount of people that don't actually know about have I been pwned. I imagine this is slightly different for this audience, but nonetheless, if you don't already know about have I been pwned and you're not using that within your business already, would really encourage you to go and check that out. It's something that is freely available. You can do it in a personal level. So you can type in your own email address in there and see where you've been breached and where they've been reported, have I been pwned. But you can also do it on a your own domain level. So if you can basically prove ownership of the domain in the second screenshot there, you can actually pull back those results and get an idea of which of your corporate email addresses have been involved in the breaches. So it's not perfect. For example, that you don't get the password, so it's quite hard to understand whether it's relevant, but it's an absolutely terrific source for security teams that perhaps can't invest in getting a new threat intelligence tool or digital risk protection solution. This is a really, really good starting point, particularly if you think about some of those additional tips for demonstrating what you're doing in terms of the business to the executives. So yes, Troy Hunt, he is incredible. Somebody chats in, and that is absolutely correct. So check that out if you don't know that already. Would very much encourage you to do so. I reference a lot of the material in here. Not all of it is available within this report, which goes into a lot of detail about not only things like Open Bullet, but also other tools. We also looked into specifically dark web marketplaces. So looking at the different trades of different goods, what's going on there, essentially trying to demystify the dark web community, because I think it does need a bit of demystifying. There's plenty of risk on the non-dark web that perhaps we can talk about afterwards. And then I thought I'd just finish by talking about what Digital Shadows and what Searchlight are doing within this. I'll just flash up this again to remind people that most of these 15 or 16 billion credentials are actually in plain text. So this is a huge number and potentially a little bit overwhelming for organizations, but it also provides this enormous opportunity, because if they're already in this format, and there's so many of them, and we need to reduce that to more of a sensible number, the security team doesn't necessarily have time to be going through all of these, we can actually go and validate those. So as well as just alerting on every new credential that we see, we realize that's just too much for organizations and most security teams. So especially as if once one credential is exposed and that gets reused, in reality, once you've reset a credential, that risk is already mitigated and the rest of it's just noise. So what we essentially completely changed our model. So we just alert now on a credential basis. So once you've done that credential pair and that's been triaged and responded to, that's done. You can still access that information, but you don't need to go and action it. And critically, we've done some really cool stuff around automated validation. So we've got 3 main ways of doing that. First, you've got the credential format. So many people, many security teams in the organizations will have a password format that people must adhere to. So in this one, it's 15 characters, lowercase numbers and uppercase characters. If it doesn't meet those thresholds, we can actually automatically reject that alert, because most people, they actually care about, is this going to actually enable an account takeover? Is this legitimate access to our network? So actually, you can still access the information, but in terms of what you have to go and action, it can automatically be rejected. We can also look that up against things like Okta. Are those email addresses valid in your current directory? So can we actually understand whether live that's actually something that poses a risk to us? And finally, can you actually just go and we like to talk about these advanced tools, but actually the majority of people correlate newly exposed credentials with a list, an export of their known email addresses from their directory. So you can actually upload a CSV into our system. And again, if that doesn't match, then you can automatically invalidate that based on the email address. So often these things that get exposed aren't even valid email addresses, never mind passwords. So we're really excited about this. It's gone on really, really well with our client base. And so if you would like to actually have a deeper understanding of this or a demo, I can take you through it live and see how that manifests. Actually, would love for you to swing by our booth on level or area 1, and you'll see the Digital Shadows logo, and there's myself, Philip, and Scott, who'll be there to answer any questions, and we can do a bit of a live demo of these credential alerts as well, if people are interested in that. Just a question on the general chat: are the slides for this presentation available? Absolutely. They can be. I will work out the best method for distributing those. I understand this presentation is being possibly recorded and uploaded to YouTube, so you could have access there. But if you send me your email address, I'm also happy to send on a copy of the slides and answer any questions that you may have. So I think that's everything that I had. Oh, just a few screenshots of the type of different validation. So you can see those there. So that's all that I had. We can expand the conversation if we so wish to how we try and go a bit more proactive. So looking at whether we can pick domains that are impersonating, trying to harvest credentials, mobile apps, spoof social media, trying to catch those before they target employees and customers. So we're trying to have that proactive stance. So if you remember back to right at the beginning slide where I showed all those different things that are exposed online, if we remove those, I think we can do a really good job of just making life harder for the attacker. So I think, I can't remember who it said, it may have been the ASD, Australian Signals Directorate, if I've said that correctly. They had a great piece of advice, which is just like, let's just increase attacker costs. Let's not worry about these advanced 0 days and espionage campaigns and APTs that are all really interesting. But if we can just get these basics done, the ASD Essential 8 is fantastic. Let's get the basics, reduce the opportunity attackers have, and just give ourselves a better shot. So yeah, I thought I'd finish on some nice ASD Essential 8 material, because that's some of the best advice out there, I think. And that's everything I had for today. I have left about 3 minutes less than I intended to, so my apologies. If you do have any questions, really happy to answer these on any topic around account takeover, credentials, or anything else. MFA is indeed is something that is all lauded as the easy solution for everything, and I appreciate it's not always as straightforward as it's made out to be. Yeah. Any other questions?
Mike, thank you very much. It's fantastic.
All right. Thanks for your time, everybody. Appreciate it. And swing by our booth if you want to continue the conversation.
Cheers, mate. Thanks, guys. The next speaker will be Mikey Perry, and he'll be talking about some adversary emulation. Stuff's a really good way to end the day. So that'll be in a couple of minutes' time. We'll see you all then.